Hello, and a very warm welcome for this lecture on Vikings live streaming from the Isle of Man. I'm Fenella Bazin, and I have been a Viking resident historian for over 3 years now since the programme started, and before that I was a lecturer. And I love being on Viking Ocean and talking about these subjects which are so dear to my heart. Now, if, like me, you were taught at school that the Vikings were ruthless, bloodthirsty pirates who liked nothing better than raiding monasteries and stealing loot and going back to their homelands with it, I hope that this lecture will give you an idea of what other lives were like in the Viking Age. People who are much more recognisable to us, people like farmers and fishermen, merchants, and particularly craftsmen. And I will be spending a little bit of time on lives of women as well, who have been sadly neglected during the decades, during the centuries since people got interested in Vikings again. But first, I'd like you to imagine that you're living about 1100 years ago and you're standing on a beach somewhere in Northern Europe and you see this image suddenly. This is the first slide. You see this Viking ship bearing down on you. What would be your immediate reaction? For so many people, when I've been giving this lecture live in the Star Theatre, they say, oh, we'd be scared, we'd be running for our lives. But there are all sorts of reasons, other reasons as well, that you might have this ship arriving. It might be a merchant from foreign lands or from other parts of Scandinavia coming with lovely goods for you to trade and perhaps a chance to make quite a lot of money. It could also be a ship returning from lots of adventures, from explorations across the North Atlantic, perhaps as far as Greenland. You wouldn't have had news of them for years, perhaps. And you see this coming, and there's such joy and jubilation, wondering just who has survived the journey and what they're bringing back. Or it could simply be a fishing expedition returning home after a good day's fishing. Let's then look at what we're going to talk about. This lecture is divided into 4 different sections. I'm going to talk first of all about who were the Vikings. They certainly wouldn't have recognised themselves if you would have said, are you a Viking? They'd have looked very puzzled. Because Viking to them was a verb. It meant to go exploring, to go on a voyage somewhere, trading or perhaps raiding as well. And it was, for them, it was a verb, not a noun. I'd be looking at their expeditions and their settlements. Unlike the Romans, who tended to impose their culture, in fact, not just tended to, they did impose their culture on the places where they settled. The Vikings didn't do that, and I shall talk quite a lot about that. But their expeditions are quite extraordinary, across open seas for days, sometimes weeks on end, in open vessels. And then something of their daily life, how their lives were lived. Again, very familiar things to us. They didn't have the technology, of course, but they had routines and they had all sorts of wonderful recipes as well. I won't have time to give you any of those, but they were very good. And then finally, I'll be looking at their legacy and civilization, a word that we don't often connect with Vikings, but it might surprise you to learn that these merchants that I mentioned had codes of practice, and that later in the Viking Age, in cities like Bergen, for instance, there were actually town planning legislation. So let's move on now to the next slide. Who were they? What did they look like? Well, this image might not be particularly accurate because it was made some 3 or 4 centuries after this man lived. He is King Harald Fairhair, the first king of a united Norway. But you can see from their clothes, and things didn't change very much. Fashions might have changed slightly, but overall, they were people who would have been wearing these sort of trousers, tunics with belts, perhaps a linen shirt underneath, and a cloak on top. And I'll talk a little bit about what they might have looked like later on. So let's go on to the next slide now. And I want to talk about Vikings, the popular image of Vikings with horns on their helmets. Even if you land in Shetland on one of the excursions, you'll find that you're greeted by Vikings who've got great wings on their helmets. This is an invention by Richard Wagner, who wrote the Ring Cycle in the 19th century. If you just think about it, that image on the right-hand side is a typical Viking helmet. There are very few which have come out of archaeological sites. This is one of them. They did not have horns. And the reason, of course, is very practical. Because if you're in hand-to-hand fighting and you suddenly find that the horns on your helmet would be grabbed, you wouldn't be able to get away. And the next thing you wouldn't know about is that your head had been chopped off. So helmets were definitely without horns. Sorry about that, Minnesota Vikings, but it's a very impressive logo anyway. The image above there is an image perhaps nearly 1,000 years before the Viking Age from the Anglo-Saxons. And it shows a ritual helmet, something which is quite different. So let's go on to the next slide. We've sorted out helmets now. I've busted one myth already, and I hope there'll be more to come. Now, how do we know about them? Well, lots of sources, except from the Vikings themselves, who did not write their own history. So their history was written for them by the people they attacked. But later on, sort of 2 or 3 centuries after the Viking Age, when the Icelanders were very settled and producing manuscripts and books like there was no tomorrow, we have these sagas. We have the history sagas for a start. One of the great saga writers was this man, Snorri Sturluson, splendidly named. And you will find statues of him, there's one of him, in fact, in Bergen, just outside of the Viking Museum. So we have learnt a lot from that. There are also family sagas, the Viking equivalent of Downton Abbey, perhaps. Archaeological sites, of course. And as archaeology has progressed over the decades, we're learning more and more about what they ate, what the environment was like around them, because there's so much now. And taking DNA, of course, from skeletons, we can learn a lot from that. On the bottom right is a stone that I'll be talking about later. It was erected by King of Denmark, Harald Bluetooth, announcing the fact that he had Christianized the whole of Denmark. But I'll give you more details of that later on. And on the top right, silver hoards. Now, if there was danger of an invasion, someone would go and bury their wealth. If they were killed or taken prisoner, taken to be a slave perhaps, they wouldn't be able to get back. But metal detectorists are now finding these hoards, and we're learning a lot from them. This particular hoard was quite amusing because it was in a program, a television program, about metal detectorists and how a lot of the time they weren't finding anything. So the presenter took out a metal detector into a field and it went berserk, and they found this incredible silver hoard as a result. So those are some of the sources of information: archaeological sites, the sagas, the rune stones, and the silver hoards. Shall we go on to the next slide now and see what we're going to talk about there? Right, I mentioned merchants and traders, and this is a very nice artist's impression of what a trading post in the west of Norway might have looked like during the Viking Age. Bergen certainly would have looked like this. Nowadays, of course, it's very, very different. But there were little quays, little jetties pushing out into the fjord, and on the shore would be a warehouse, and then behind the warehouse very often there would be a dwelling house as well. In Bergen, of course, this became very sophisticated with the Hanseatic merchants, and they even had a bank there, a stone-built building with very small windows that couldn't be burgled. Merchants were very important. They travelled by sea, they travelled long, long distances. They went as far as the Silk Road, or certainly met up with the Silk Road merchants. They travelled vast distances and brought back all sorts of exotic things, some of which I'll be talking about shortly. The next slide is going to show us where the Vikings lived. Those who lived in Norway had pretty harsh living conditions, except in the southeast, which was much more low-lying. There was more agricultural land. But those of you who've been to Norway, sailed along the west coast, will realise there's not a lot of land that can be worked agriculturally. But this also leads me to another point, that we talk about the Vikings as a homogeneous group. They're not really, because the Norwegian Vikings lived in this sort of world of great mountains of fjords pushing their way inland, long way inland. But the Danes, the image on the right-hand side, had a much cushier time. In fact, the climate there is very much like that of the British Isles in many ways, because the northern part of Denmark, in Jutland, is just slightly north of Aberdeen. Those of you who know your British Isles map will know that's quite a long way north in Scotland, but it's still got a long way to go before you get to the very north of the British Isles. And the southernmost part is roughly on the same latitude as York. So Denmark had a very different topography and therefore very different lifestyle. Sweden, again, was very different. Those of you who've been on the Baltic cruise will know that it's lakes and forests, very flat from the parts, lots of islands, lots of archipelagos. In fact, the whole of Scandinavia, apart from the mainland, is a huge mass of islands, tens of thousands of them altogether. So this is where they lived. Let's see now what sort of things they did. Right, they were explorers. I've mentioned that already. They travelled. They seemed to always want to know what was over the horizon, what they could find out next. And of course, they were enabled to do this. They were enabled to do this because they had these wonderful ships that they built. They were pioneers in ship design. I'll talk in more detail about that too. They were innovators. They had ideas which they brought back from other parts of the world, particularly from the Middle East, from Persia, modern-day Iran, where they learnt how to make hardened steel and strengthened glass. Very important because in Europe at the time, most people were still following the recipe that the Romans had followed, and that made very brittle glass, so you could only make very small objects. They were innovators, they were settlers, and they were assimilators. When they settled, they didn't, I'll talk more about that later, but they didn't impose themselves. They took something of the local conditions and they gave something there too. So this is our image of the Vikings, and these are modern perceptions. I haven't mentioned the fact that they were raiders and pillagers on this, because they were the minority of the population. There weren't that many of them in relation to the rest of the population. Shall we move on? I can talk about this for ages. So let's move on now. We have a fairly good idea of who the Vikings were. Let's see where they went to and what their settlements were like. And then after that, we'll go on to how they lived when they were there. But this is exploring their known world. Now, when you think about it, it was a vast area. I've mentioned already that they travelled as far as the Mediterranean. They travelled, the Swedes particularly, looking eastwards because their coast's on the Baltic, they travelled across the Baltic into the Gulf of Finland, into where St. Petersburg now stands, beyond there, up these great rivers, to Novgorod, to that great port which they helped to develop, and as far down as Kiev, which is really another Viking settlement as well, into Constantinople, now modern-day Istanbul, where many of them became members of the Varangian Guards, the people who looked after the Byzantine emperor, who was ruling over what had been the eastern province, the eastern area of the Roman Empire. They then moved into the Mediterranean too, sometimes. Certainly there are ruins in Istanbul, in Hagia Sophia. Some of you may have had them pointed out when you've been there. The Danes, on the other hand, travelled south and west, across the North Sea to the English coast, and of course it was their ancestors, a few hundred years before, the Jutes from the north of Denmark, from Jutland, the Angles from southern Denmark, who had teamed up with the Saxons, raided and settled in England, and then fought Alfred the Great, the great Anglo-Saxon who was there. That's another story, which is a fascinating one. They went further down through the English Channel, raiding the north coast of France. And they became such a pest there that the French king invited them to settle in Normandy. He gave them the land there, and the leader, he gave the hand of his daughter, that they would protect the rest of France from other Vikings coming along. They then continued down along the French coast, the Spanish coast, into the Mediterranean. Now, the Norwegian Vikings, on the other hand, because of latitudinal sailing, longitudinal sailing was very difficult because they didn't have the equipment to be able to, they didn't have the timekeeping, they didn't have the equipment to be able to do longitudinal sailing. Latitudinal sailing was much easier. Now, Shetland, the Shetland Islands, the capital of which is Lerwick, are closer to Norway than any other part of the British Isles. And Shetland is actually closer to Norway than it is to the Scottish capital of Edinburgh, which might be quite a surprise. So that was one of the first ports of call, both for trading and then later for raiding and settling. From there, they travelled across the North Atlantic to the Faroes and then to Iceland. And in Iceland, they found a land which only had a very, very small handful of people living there, probably Irish monks, though even that now is being questioned by some of the scholars. So they found a new land, uninhabited. They could claim land, they could settle there. And once they'd settled there, they set up what was effectively a proto-democracy, a parliament which still exists, one of the longest lasting parliaments in the world, the Icelandic one. And then, for many of them, they wanted to go on further. Some of them had to because they were outlaws, people like Eric the Red. And they went on to Greenland. And then North America was discovered quite by chance by a merchant who got blown up off course, didn't land, but went back to Greenland and told them all about it. And there was all sorts of things that they had otherwise had to get from the east, from Norway, from the homelands, things like timber, which was a very important product. So that are some of their expeditions. They covered an area which is roughly a quarter of the globe north of the Mediterranean. It's quite remarkable. Let's go on, because that's something I could talk about for a long time too. But let's get to the raiders now. The first shock in 793, the first recorded raid on a monastery in England. Lindisfarne, also known as Holy Island, just off the northeast coast of Northumberland, connected by a causeway. They raided this monastery, killed a lot of the monks and took a lot of loot with them. But how did they know that that monastery was there? Well, it must have been stories coming back from some of the traders, because they were had been trading for many centuries across the North Sea. You'll see on the left-hand side there an image from a memorial stone, a gravestone, with some of the warriors wielding their swords, and you can see the odd helmet there as well. On the right-hand side is an image of the ruins of the later priory. The priory that the Vikings would have known was a much smaller building, much less ambitious. It was sited just a little bit to the east of the present one, on a slight rise near the sea, and has been recently excavated. But this wasn't limited to Lindisfarne. We know about Lindisfarne because a monk called Alcuin of York, who was by this time living in the Holy Roman Empire, he had been headhunted by Charlemagne the Great, and he was a great letter writer, and he wrote hundreds of letters, and one of them is an account of this raid. The raids continued. The following year they raided the monastery on Iona, on the Western Isles of Scotland, and then down into the Irish Sea, St. Patrick's Isle, just off the Irish coast. So they knew about these places. Word had got back. Why did they raid them? Well, it was easy pickings. They waited a few years, came back again once the monks had restocked, and got more gold and silver, but also manuscripts, which might be a bit of a surprise, because they couldn't read them, but their rulers could. And to be able to give a gift to your chieftain or to the king of one of these wonderfully illuminated manuscripts was very precious. So although many manuscripts must have been lost, a lot of them survived. And they survived because the manuscripts from Iona, which was the great centre of these illuminated manuscript monks, were sent down to Kells in Ireland. And the book that we now know as the Book of Kells was probably made in Scotland. So let's go on and see what happens next. Well, this is the chronology of the expeditions and the settlements. You can see that the earliest ones, coloured dark brown, are the settlements by the people we now refer to as Vikings. They were part of a great wave of migration, global migration. They'd come in from the east and settled in Scandinavia. They moved a little bit further north, right up to the Lofoten Islands, and those of you who've been there will have probably seen that wonderful Viking house that has been reconstructed on the Lofoten Islands. They were starting to move into places like Shetland and Orkney and the Western Isles of Scotland as well. And the Danes, as we know, were moving into the east of England. They were also, the earliest settlements were in Iceland, on the west coast of Iceland rather than the east, and also along the west coast of Greenland. So the green areas there are areas that they travelled to. They probably raided, they certainly traded, but they didn't necessarily settle. So let's go on. Next slide, please. When they settled, they built houses very much as they had done at home. This is the rather romantically named Jarlshof from the Shetland Islands, named actually by Sir Walter Scott, who visited it. No one had ever called it Jarlshof before, but he thought it was a very appropriate title, the home of the Earl. And you can see that the walls are partly stone, and above there would have been turf, and probably a turf roof as well, with a central hearth. Very typical Viking longhouse, shaped slightly like a boat, with bowed sides to it. As I said, whatever they could get their hands on was what they built. So in Shetland, there was very little timber, so they built with stone. And on the next slide, when they got to Lazo Meadows in the Newfoundland, they built completely out of turf because that was there, it was available. It was a very, very good insulated too, because you could just add more and more to it as the winters got colder, as they did towards the 13th century. This, of course, is not the original building. It's a replica of the site very close by, which was called, until the 1950s and 60s, Indian Village. But then it was realised that it was Viking, and the excavations proved it beyond doubt. Quite an important settlement. Let's move on from here then and look at how they were able to do this. With their wonderful ships, the innovative ships that they built, quite an extraordinary, novel design. Like other shipbuilders and wooden boats, they laid down a keel first, but unlike the other shipbuilders who would put ribs on next and then clad the ribs with planks of wood, the Vikings put the keel down and then put the planks of wood in next, finally putting strakes across the ship to stiffen it. This had lots of advantages. One was that it was a lot lighter than the conventional vessels. Another one, that it was very flexible and could actually ride the waves rather than resisting the waves. It was fast, it was double-ended, so you could run it up on the shore and run it straight out into the water again without having to turn it round. And the other great advantage, particularly for the Swedes, was when they were trading along these great Russian rivers, they would get to the headwaters of one river and they would have to portage the ship and its contents along to the head of the next river. It was lighter to portage. There's also a spot in Shetland where they portaged across a very narrow stretch of land, just hardly more than sort of 100 yards wide, where to avoid having to go around the north of the islands where there were very strong currents. So it had huge advantages. It was an adaptable design too, because it could be a warship, or they could build something which was rather broader in the beam in relation to its length, which was called a knar, which was the trading vessel. It was also useful as a small fishing boat, and some of this particular design is still used in some parts of the areas which the Vikings had settled, places like Shetland Islands. So they were innovative shipbuilders, and this was the reason that they were able to do these great journeys in open boats. One king boasted that he had not slept under a roof for 3 years. If they met very bad weather, they would lower the sail and use that as a sort of shelter, but that didn't happen that often. Shall we move on to the next slide now? Now, I've mentioned that they were assimilators. They settled in places, they intermarried, so you get a mixture of names. Their language is crossed over, so we get certain words which come from Old Norse. And in fact, a colleague of mine made a film many years ago comparing life in the western fjords of Norway with that in the dales of the Lake District of northwest England. They used English for the programme, of course, but when the two men went into the shearing shed, they lapsed into their own dialects and they were able to converse, which is quite extraordinary. And you wouldn't believe it, but the producer actually cut that bit out of it. They integrated economically too, because they set up their own businesses, they were trading. They also brought new blood, which was important for some of the more remote islands. And they assimilated their cultures and their religious ideas. Now, this stone is quite extraordinary. If you look at it, it's nothing to do with Christianity. It's a strange, strange figure. Some people say it's a depiction of the devil himself, but others say that it's actually the god that made mischief. It was a troublemaker, Loki, known as Loga in the ring cycle. And this is an interesting image because he is bound so he can't move. What the horns are, no one's quite sure. This is what makes them think he's the devil personified. But this is what he was. He had to endure this for the end of his life. The pagans, the Viking pagans, knew that their religion wouldn't last forever. They knew that something else would take over. And this was when Ragnarok happened. Ragnarok was the end, the downfall of the gods, the Götterdämmerung. And this, showing on this piece of carved stone, is indicating perhaps that Ragnarok has happened. There's another carving that I'll show you later on in which the similar message is put over. So let's move on now. They stopped being invaders, they became settlers, and in many ways they were quite attractive. If you go into the Heritage Centre on any of the Viking ocean ships, you'll find that there are bone combs, and every Viking carried a bone comb. They were known to comb their hair. Even better, they washed once a week, every Saturday. And they regularly changed their clothes. So you do wonder what was going on in other societies too. So perhaps they were quite attractive when they arrived. Certainly they were novel, and some of them must have been rather stunning, I think. And of course, it was something new. Let's move on then, bearing in mind that they were perhaps handsome seducers. And we're starting to look now at what their daily life was like. Now, as I mentioned, we would perhaps recognise quite a lot of the things that they did and they had to do. But a lot of the other things, they had to be self-sufficient in many ways. Shall we have the next slide, please? Their homes, as I said, were built of whatever materials were local. These are from a site at Fyrkat in the north of Denmark in Jutland. You might have a chance to get there at some point if you go on one of the trips that takes you through a place called Aalborg. And you can see they're built of timber, but very differently. Some of them are thatched and some of them have wooden shingles, the wooden tiles on the lower picture on the right-hand side. So these were some of the sorts of houses that they lived in. Let's move on and see what else we can find out about them. I mentioned that I'm going to talk about women because their role was almost totally ignored by a lot of the early writers. And in fact, they were a very important part of the life. They did, after all, constitute at least 50% of the population. Women had a lot of rights if they were born Vikings. The wife of a chieftain, for instance, had she was a very powerful person. When her husband went away, which he probably did, he might be a merchant, he might be going on all sorts of journeys, she was the person who ruled the community. Not another man nominated by her husband, but she did. She had with her all the members of her family, of course, and extended family, servants and slaves, because the Vikings, like every other society at the time, were built on slavery. That was one of their great trading things, of course, were slaves. We tend to forget that. She was ultimately responsible for keeping the community going, for making sure that during the spring, the summer and the autumn, they were able to grow, gather and preserve the food they would need, not just for the winter, but just in case the following summer wasn't going to be a very good one. They had to have plenty of supplies. There were no supermarkets down the road. They had to make their own clothes too. And on the right-hand side, you'll see a couple of women. One of them is spinning, and she's not using a spinning wheel, but something called a spindle. You can see it at the bottom of that yarn. It can, once people once they are practiced in this, it's a very quick way of making yarn. Then had to be woven. And the looms were upright rather than flat. And they were also used for making sails. So if you go to the museum at Roskilde, not far from Copenhagen, you'll see that they have very often there's someone there weaving wool for sails. And then the image on the left-hand side is that of a chieftain's wife, a very important woman. She's wearing typical chieftain's wife's gear. This shows she is very high role in society. She has on her feet some sort of skin boots. And then she wears a linen shift. And then over that is a woolen tunic. In this case, it's rather pretty dusky pink, but blues were also very popular as well. And over that, she wears a pinafore dress, and the straps you'll see are held in place by two brooches, from which hang these wonderful beads. Now, these beads were very valuable, they were very important, and they tell you a lot about the family, because they would be not only beads that were made locally, but beads brought back from places that perhaps her husband or some of her ancestors had visited. So I know of one necklace, for instance, and I was there at the excavation when it was discovered, where there were beads not only from Scandinavia, but from the northeast of England, and jet from Whitby. There was amber, of course, from the Baltic, but very, very specially, there was actually a bead which had been made in Persia. Very special bead, very technical, much more highly technical than any of the other beads. So these are sort of a history of the family, and sometimes they were buried with the woman. From her waist, she has hanging a little leather pouch in which she'd have her sewing kit and her little shears, rather like garden, not the sort of garden shears with two handles, but they're sprung shears which you can use. People still use them to shear sheep. I've used them myself, and some people still use them for needlework. She also has, hanging from her belt, a knife in a sheath. The knife has got wire, silver wire around its handle, very expensive. She might also have amulets, because she was, again, ultimately responsible for the health of the community. There were no doctors, so all the healing had to be done through gathering of herbs, gathering and drying of herbs. She was also able to have a lot of rights. Once her husband had died, and very often the women did outlive their men because the men were living such dangerous lives, she was able to inherit his estate. Now, she was also able to inherit her father's estate if she was the eldest of a family of girls. Now, this was not the case in Britain. Just think of Jane Austen's book, Pride and Prejudice, where the whole story hinges on the fact that there's a family of girls who are not allowed to inherit. So 1,000 years before that women could inherit. She was also able to divorce her husband, just as he could divorce her. They had to have good grounds for it, but she had rights. And she was expected to be a free thinker, to speak her own mind. And there were some remarkable women who came out of the sagas that you read. One of the most remarkable is a woman called Un, the deep-minded. She was the daughter of one of the men who had fled Norway when Harald Fairhair had united it and came to the throne. He had been very strict in the way that he wanted his chieftains to work, and a lot of them were not very happy with that idea. So they decided to leave Norway and settle elsewhere. Two of her brothers went to Iceland, but her father took the family to the British Isles, to the Irish Sea area, where they settled. She was married off to the King of Dublin, and he reigned for another 20 years or so until he was killed, at which point she and all her family travelled with her son to the northwest of Scotland, to Caithness, where he became king in that area. And in due course of time, too, he was killed in battle. She then called all her henchmen, all her family, all her slaves, all her servants to her and said, I'm swearing you to the utmost secrecy. We're going to build a ship because we're leaving this benighted land where I have lost a husband and a son. And during the winter, they built this ship, an extraordinary achievement when you think of the amount of timber that had to be cut and shaped, the amount of iron that had to be forged to provide nails and all the fittings for the ship, the sail that had to be done. And in the spring, they embarked with lots of provisions and they set off. Their first port of call were the Orkney Islands, where she married off one of her granddaughters. I don't think her daughter-in-law had much say in all this. The daughter-in-law never appears in the story. They then moved over to the Faroes, where again she married off another granddaughter. And in both places, they became the originators of some of the great families of those areas. And then, rather than going back to Norway, she set off for Iceland. And there, they were shipwrecked as they got to the coast. They all scrambled onto shore, they were all saved. And she then set off to go and visit one of her brothers. He was slightly horrified. He was very welcoming, but he was slightly horrified because he said they'd had not a very good harvest and they couldn't put up with all these people. There could have been 30, 40, maybe even more people. Can you imagine having a party that size descending on you for the whole winter? Oh, well, she said, that's no good. And she then goes over to the other brother who welcomes her with open arms and says that, yes, she can stay with them. In the spring, she borrows one of her brother's boats. They go out to sea. They throw over the high seat of the family. This was a tradition. They follow it in then into the coast to see where the currents are going to bring in things like timber or where there are good currents for fishing. And there she claimed a lot of land, freed her slaves, gave her henchmen land for themselves, and then she turned to one of her grandsons this time and said, my boy, you're going to get married. This was after some time when they'd settled in. You're going to get married. Go and find yourself a wife, because at the end of the summer, I'm going to give you a huge party, which will be your wedding party. And indeed that happened. And parties in those days weren't just a few hours. This was a whole week of party going. At the end of it, she walks in a stately way down the length of the long house and says, I'm now going to bed. I'm a very old woman. I am 59, which in those days was quite a remarkable age. A lot of women never survived beyond childbirth in their 20s. Her grandson went in to see her the next morning. She was still sitting in her chair, but she died in her sleep. Job done. So that perhaps has given you an idea of what role the women had in society. Let's move on now and see other aspects of their daily life. Food and drink. There were usually 2 meals a day, one in the morning, another one when the work was finished in the evening. Food was cooked over a central hearth, and that was the only ironware that they had. They didn't have pottery very much either. Wood was the preferred material for things for the table, for dishes. They didn't use forks, of course, in those days. It was still knives, which everyone had, and wooden spoons for drinking up the soup that was left from the stews that they made. Drink, of course, well, small beer, which would be the normal drink, but a wealthy man might import wine from the Rhineland. And the great banquets that they held, there would be a huge horn which would not have any legs on it, so you could put it down in between drinks. It had to be passed around the whole company until it was empty. On special occasions, they even used tablecloths. So, as I say, quite a lot of things that we would recognise in Viking life. Let's go on now and look at another aspect of it. Trading. I've talked quite a lot about trading, and here we have an example of some of the currency that they used. Later in the Viking Age, they used coins, but not earlier on. The coin on the top right is one that was minted in York. There were Viking mints all over the British Isles particularly. Below that is another silver hoard, this time from the northwest of England, from a place called Curedale. Dale, incidentally, of course, is a Norwegian word, as it are names like Ness, Ness, which is a promontory, or By, which means a settlement. The stone I showed you earlier came from Kirby Stephen, and Kirby is a very old Norse name. The silver that they used were not in coins, but they weighed them, as you can see from this merchant's scales. And sometimes, in a deal, the trader, the person who was buying, might not have quite enough silver. So he'd turn to his wife and say, dear, do you remember that lovely silver bracelet I gave you some time ago? Well, I need to cut a bit off it now because I haven't got quite enough to buy this cow or this bale of wool or whatever it happened to be. So it's known as hack silver for that reason. Now let's look at some of the other aspects of daily life. Currency, as I say, only came in later because of their trading with the Middle East. I mentioned in my introduction these wonderful craftsmen, and some of the greatest craftsmen were people who were wood carvers. The image on the left is from a portal with 4 of these images on each side of a church. Church now demolished, but the portal has survived. And this is an image of one of the legends, a pagan legend, at the entrance to a church. And if you go into the Stave Church, for instance, in Bergen, and look carefully at the sides of the pews, you'll see this same story, the story of Sigurd the Volsung. He becomes Siegfried in the ring cycle, of course. And here on the left hand of the image is Regin, who was one of the greatest blacksmiths of the time. And blacksmiths had very high status in society because those were the people who made swords, for instance. And the sword was life or death. If you had a good sword, that would be fine. If it wasn't very good, that might mean you weren't fine at all. And they also made things for houses, for the homes. Now, Regin, it's a long story, I'll just give a very brief account of it. Regin wanted Sigurd to go and fight a dragon because the dragon was guarding a gold hoard. What Sigurd didn't know was that the dragon was actually Regin's brother who had changed shape. Now, the first 2 swords that they tried to forge didn't work. Sigurd took them, smashed them against the anvil, and they came to bits. And then Sigurd, who was not the brightest button perhaps in the box, suddenly remembers that he has the remnants, the pieces of his father's sword, a magic sword which Sigmund had had. And he goes and fetches those. Regin then forges that, and instead of the sword breaking on the anvil, the sword breaks the anvil. Now, I think this is partly a folk memory of, or a way of telling the story of how the Vikings came to know about steel. Because an iron sword is quite brittle, but the making of steel, a technique they learnt when they were over in the Middle East, was brought back to the West. And some of the greatest sword makers were also in the Rhineland. You only had a sword if you were extremely wealthy. Most people went to fight a combat of some sort using axes. Only the chieftains and the very wealthy people would have swords. The image on the right-hand side is one of my favourite carvings that I've ever seen. It's at a place called Urnes in one of the western fjords of Norway. And it gave its name to this style, which of course was very popularised by the Art Nouveau artists of the early 20th century. If you look at it very carefully, in that central section, you can see an animal. It has spirals for its joints and it's got a long neck. If you follow that long neck up, you'll see that there is a snake above it, and the snake, the serpent, has its jaws across the neck of the deer. But the deer also has its jaw over the serpent. No one knows quite what this was. At the time, no doubt people would understand the reference, but it's the quality of the carving which is so extraordinary. Those tendrils and those little leaves, they are so delicate. And there's very deep carving as well. It's very three-dimensional. The section next to it is obviously based on some of the metalwork that would have come back from Ireland. You can see that design. So these were some of the great craftsmen. Let's look at some other craftsmen too. The smiths, there were goldsmiths and silversmiths. So let's have a look at the next slide. Oh no, sorry, I've got textiles next. Textiles were very important. The last slide in this programme will show you the Bayeux Tapestry, but this is the tapestry from Sweden. And you can see in the centre of it, there is a church. And in that church are two bells being frantically rung by three figures below because they're being invaded on the right-hand side. These were quite common, but not on the scale of the Bayeux Tapestry. On the bottom right is a piece of textile which came out of a Viking grave, the great Oseberg ship, in which there were two women buried, two women of very high status with a great deal of very important and very expensive gear with them as well, some beautiful pieces of furniture, for instance. But this is not just an ordinary weave. If you look at it very closely, you'll see that it's a diagonal weave. It's very high status fabric. But even higher status fabric is those strips above there, strips of silk from the Far East. Now, silk, weight for weight, was valued exactly as gold. So you only had a silk garment if you were very wealthy. And you only had, because of that, if you were able to buy any silk at all, it tended to be cut into strips to border cloaks and capes. And I think the remnant of that these days is in some of the Scandinavian jackets where there is braid around the edges or sometimes just a different decoration, a different design on the borders. I think we'd better move on. I realise that time is pressing. These are the great craftsmen, of course, the jewellers, the goldsmiths and the silversmiths. On the bottom right is the hilt of a sword, which was found in Scotland, in one of the islands. Obviously, very expensive piece of equipment and a beautiful piece of metalwork. To the left is an amazing piece of gold jewellery, and on the top right is a Thor's hammer. Now, Thor was one of the great gods of the pagan groups of gods, and he was very much favoured by people who travelled. So if you go to Iceland, for instance, you'll find a lot of Thor names. And in fact, of course, Mr. Hagen himself has Thor as a prefix to his name, very appropriately, I think. Thor's hammer was used as a lucky charm, effectively, but this is a very high status one. Sometimes they were simply made out of a piece of metal or even a piece of wood. And in some places, the island that I live on, for instance, still I think some of the fishermen carry something which is the bone from the neck of a wrasse. And that bone looks very like a Thor's hammer. Let's move on and look at the next section. Civilization and legacy. We've looked who the Vikings are. We've explored some of their expeditions and their settlements. We've looked at how they lived their daily lives. Let's see now what their legacy is and what the civilization was. Not a word you always link with Viking civilization, but here is that stone again, the Yelling stone, erected by Harald Bluetooth in central Norway, the first king to Christianize Denmark. So he says. It's a big chunk of boulder. It's not a tiny little stone at all. It's, it's big. And it has some wonderful carvings on it as well. But you'll see the reason this is on here, it's called a rune stone, because those scratchings on the right-hand side are runes. This is the way that the Vikings wrote their language. This is one of the reasons they didn't really write their own history. This is fine for putting on memorial stones and for brief messages, but not for writing long pieces of work. It's mainly linear because initially it would have been used on wood, and those of you who have ever worked with wood will know that if you're going across the grain of the wood, it's very difficult to try and get some sort of curve, to carve a curve. So carving the letter S, for instance, would be very difficult. So this is the coming of Christianity. And let's move on to the next one, because we've got some interesting things here too. In the centre is one of the stave churches. I'm sure many of you will have visited or will plan to visit one of these. They're extraordinary buildings. Many have now disappeared because of legislation, I think in the 19th century in Norway, where all the churches had to be able to house a 10%, I think, of the population. So some of these churches are too small, were dismantled or burnt to the ground. But you'll see at the top of this, there are dragons, and they're protecting the church. On the right-hand side is a very interesting version of a pendant that would have been worn. It's Icelandic, and if you look, first of all, you think it's a cross, and then you realise, as you look up towards the point where it's hanging from, there's actually an animal head there. So this is a Thor's hammer, but it was probably made about the time that the Icelanders were converting to Christianity, which was the year 1000, when they had this great meeting of the midsummer meeting of the Althing, and they had to decide that they would either become Christian or the king of Norway would stop trading with them. So they managed to keep some of their pagan practices, but the majority of them moved to Christianity. But this is a sort of hedging your bets piece of gear, because it is a Thor's hammer, but it's also got a cross. On the left-hand side is a rune stone not very far from where I live. It's about 8 miles from here. It's a remnant, unfortunately. It's called the Thorvald cross. And you can see the shaft of the cross and the arm of the cross above the figure below it. The figure below it, of course, has got a raven. It's got a bird on his shoulder, which tells us this is Odin. Odin's raven, one of his 2 ravens. But if you look at the bottom, there is a wolf, Fenrir wolf. This is all part of Ragnarok, the end of the pagan religion, when all the gods would disappear. And this is really showing us that this is a first-generation settler, someone who has converted to Christianity. We don't know who he was. No one's ever found his grave or where he lived, but certainly a rather splendid stone. And incidentally, the rune stones that were raised in memory of the women were always larger than those raised in memory of the men. I don't know why. Shall we move on? The next slide then is showing us the order of the Christianization of Scandinavia. Denmark was the first to be Christianized by Harald Bluetooth, and you'll recognize his symbol here. It's a very familiar one to many of you, I'm sure. And he converted his country to Christianity partly because of political needs, because he was bordered on the southern boundaries of Denmark by countries that were already Christian. And they would have had an extra reason to invade, to say that they were trying to convert the Danes to Christianity. So it was partly a political move. The next country to be converted was Norway, and after that was Sweden. So that's the order of the Christianization. And I think we better move on to the next slide, which will show us the Bayeux Tapestry. Now, I think the very first time I was on Viking Star, way back in the spring of 2015, one of the other lecturers said to me, "What's the Bayeux Tapestry doing on a Viking ship?" And my jaw rather dropped, because of course these were descendants of Vikings, fighting descendants of Vikings. Now, 1066, we all know, probably one of the few dates we can all remember from school is the Battle of Hastings, when William of Normandy, Duke of Normandy, invaded England and defeated Harold Godwinson, who was the Anglo-Saxon king. But it's not the end of the Viking Age. The end of the Viking Age had actually come 3 weeks earlier, up in the northeast of England, just outside of York, at a place called Stamford Bridge, when Harald Hardrada had invaded from Norway. He was king of Norway, had invaded the northeast of England and been defeated by Harold Godwinson, who then heard that William had landed on the south coast, and he had to take his troops something like 270 miles to fight another battle. having marched 200 miles from London to York in the first place. It's a story which I'm sure many of you will have heard when you've been on the Viking cruises, because it's one of the standard lectures on, I think, virtually every cruise to explain the Bayeux Tapestry. It's an extraordinary piece of work. However, 1066 doesn't actually mark the Viking age, the Viking period, in all of Britain. It does in England, certainly, but in the northwest and into Scotland, the Scottish Islands, and in Ireland as well, it continues for another couple of hundred years. And the last Viking invasion of the British Isles was in 1265, just 200 years after Hastings. Rather a half-hearted invasion, which didn't really come to anything, but it took place at a place called Largs, not far from Glasgow. So that's worth remembering. So I think I better summarise now, because I've been talking rather a long time. I'm just going to have a quick sip of water. We've looked at the lives of people who lived in the Viking Age, people who were explorers. They travelled such great distances, learned such a lot, and took their culture elsewhere too. They were pioneers. They were innovators. They had ideas of their own, but they also absorbed ideas from other people. They settled, they brought their culture to other societies, and we still have some of that today. And they assimilated into those societies. So you get in the first or second generation the gravestones which give the name of a Viking father and a Celtic name, for instance, for his son. Now, before I go, I'm hoping you've got lots of questions. I think some have been coming in as I've been talking. So I'm going to look away from this screen in a moment. But first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for watching this. And I hope that this has perhaps given you an idea, a little more information about the Viking Age. And I hope I'll be meeting some of you on cruises in the not too distant future. Please do come up and talk, because as you probably gather, I do like talking. I love sharing the knowledge and the joy of travelling as well. Meeting people is one of the best bits of cruising. So thank you very much for watching. Do keep well, and I look forward to seeing you again sometime. Goodbye. Now, questions. I shall have a look at these, and I'll take them in the order that they've. Let me see now. Oh, that's nice. Was the dagger worn by the women for decorative ceremonial purposes? This is Peter from Kelowna. I hope I've said it properly. Yes, it was partly that. It was partly to protect as well, maybe against wild animals, but principally to use around the house, to use when they were cooking. The knife, everyone carried knives, not for aggressive purposes, because they were useful, rather like people loved carrying penknives around when I was young. They don't do so much now. And then Tony from Springfield. What were the objects of value other than silver objects that Viking traders used to pay for? Oh, right. It tended to be mainly silver. They might have bartered. They would have taken furs with them. They'd have taken timber into some of the areas, but principally items that could only be found in the areas where they lived. For instance, the Greenlanders had used a lot of walrus ivory, and they carved that. So that some of you may have seen these wonderful Lewis chessmen, which had been on display in all sorts of places, and you can buy replicas of them too. And those are made from Greenlandic ivory, which would be carved in Trondheim, one of the great cities of the Viking Age in Norway. So they would perhaps barter, but they would certainly use the silver to buy things with. Were the slaves from conquered tribes or from less areas of other countries? This is Al from Pleasanton. What a lovely name, in California. Bet you're having better weather than we are at the moment. It's cool here and cloudy. Yes, they traded slaves. This was, as I said, quite common amongst all sorts of societies. And in fact, the women of the Faroes and Iceland as well have in their DNA a high proportion, something like 2/3 of their DNA, 66% of their DNA, is from the northwest of the British Isles. So they had been captured and carried off by the Vikings, possibly as wives, maybe concubines, but certainly slaves. A wonderful story about a slave who had turned out to be an Irish princess. Let's scroll down and have a look at some of the others. I'm sorry I had to keep leaning over this. I've got my laptop just... it's lovely to have so many questions. Thank you. Bud from Grimsby. We live in a town in Niagara named Grimsby. Yes, it is actually Grim's settlement. It is an Old Norse name. And of course, the original Grimsby is not far from, well, it's on the east coast of England, not too far from York. Peter from Belleville. They considered Viking a verb. What did they call themselves? I suppose they call themselves Norwegian, from Norway. Of course, we know that because when the Norwegians and the Danes got, well, both Norwegians and Danes got down to the Normandy, they were known as men from the north, and that gives us the Norman, and Normandy, of course, too. Carol from Mesa, Arizona. Do I know anyone that could translate it? Oh, I'll have to look at that later. I'll come back to you about that one. Where the Vikings came from, well, as I say, most of them came from Scandinavia originally, but they would still consider that the Scandinavia was their homeland for over a period, I suspect, of several generations. I was afraid I was going to be asked this one. Lauren from, is it Ocala? How accurate do you think the show The Vikings is? Well, it's a great dramatisation. It's a great story. It's based on some of the stories from the sagas. I have to admit, I haven't seen much of it because it's quite long and I was slightly put off. But don't let me put you off it because it's a good... I know so many people who enjoy it so much. What's the most significant mark, says Harriet from Seattle, the Vikings left on arts and crafts, science and design in today's world? Well, just think about it. They brought this metallurgy technique back from the Middle East. Sweden is still known for places like Volvo, which were originally a company that made ball bearings. They made steel. The Norwegians were still known for boat design. The Danes, of course, known for their wonderful glass design as well. So some of those continue in modern forms. And I mentioned the Urness Church, and a lot of the Art Nouveau artists were very much influenced by those designs. I think I will... how are we doing for time? Oh, I've got a bit of time yet. Good. The Jean from Denver. Oh yes, what role did religion and spirituality play in Viking daily life? Yes, a question that I didn't really cover very much. It's interesting that although the Viking gods had temples in Valhalla, the Vikings themselves didn't have temples in their own lands. In fact, there was no organised religion as such. There were no priests in that sense. Each family, each area would choose its own god or gods, and they would worship them in their own way. So there was the spirituality, hard to say because it's not mentioned very much. Certainly they were, I've talked about the amulets, the Thor amulets that they carried as protection. They had a very uneasy relationship with their gods. Their gods weren't perfect, and the Vikings knew it. And it's a very, very strange relationship in many ways. It's one that's certainly worth going into, but perhaps you might like to read more about it. I've got some books here which I thought I'd mention, because there's one which, if you want to just sort of make a first go at looking at the world of the Vikings, there's one very good one here by a man called Richard Hall. It's published by Thames and Hudson, and it's called Exploring the World of the Vikings. It's very well researched, it's got some wonderful illustrations, and it's one that you can't go wrong with. If you want to go into more detail, there is a book which is now quite old. It was published in, I think, in the late 1950s, but it's still used as a textbook in universities, by P.G. Foote and D.M. Wilson. It's called The Viking Achievement, and there's a lot of detail in there. It's very much an academic book, but my goodness, it's stood the test of time. It's been going for all these decades. And David Wilson himself is still publishing material on the Vikings. I will scroll down a little bit further. We've got lots and lots of questions here. That's good. Where did I get to? I might not be able to answer all of them because of the numbers that have come in. Dennis from Largo. The Vikings must have known that the weather moderates as you travel south. Why then did the far westerly sea voyagers not explore much further southward? Another good question. It's partly to do with the fact that longitudinal sailing was difficult. It was easy to get lost and not know where you were if you travelled along the latitudes. But then once they got to the coast, of course, of the east coast of North America, it's quite likely that they travelled down there. I had a very interesting experience in, I think it was 1998, when I went to a conference in Prince Edward Island. And we had the most amazing journey by boat from the northernmost tip of the island back to Charlottetown, in which we were given a talk as we went along by an Icelandic scholar who was able to trace some of the landmarks that are described in the Vinland sagas. And he was quite convinced that the Vikings certainly got as far as that. And Prince Edward Island, of course, be a fantastic place for Vikings because they have these wonderful beaches to draw the ships up on. And it might interest you to know that the first Europeans to have known to have landed in North America were actually two Scottish slaves who were put ashore, husband and wife, put ashore because they were good runners. And they came back with something that was called grapes, but in fact is probably some sort of berry. There are also other things which suggest that they had got much further south because there were remains of food that was found in Lansett Meadows. The name escapes me for the moment. It's a form of nut, and that only grows, it doesn't grow north of the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Gulf of St. Lawrence. How long have I been lecturing for? Oh, that's like asking me how old I am. Since 1970. So mainly for the universities of Birmingham and Liverpool. I was in both universities in the Extension Studies department, so organising courses for adults and lecturing on music, of all things. But alongside my career, I have been very much involved with Vikings because when we came back to the Isle of Man to live, we had a big excavation in the 1980s, and I was the spokesperson for it, put out press releases, did radio interviews and so on, did lots of lectures. And that started me on the research of Vikings, and that's been going parallel with my professional career ever since. And Eileen of Yardley, I'm sorry I haven't had a lot of time to answer your question, but I did mention something about the brutal history of the Vikings and their raids in Ireland. As you probably know, the first raid they did was on St. Patrick's Isle, just off the east coast, the northeast coast of Ireland. They travelled all the way down, set up Dublin and Waterford and Wexford, sailed up the Shannon, raiding monasteries there as well. But Dublin was actually founded as a trading port, a very important trading port, with the Anglo-Saxons sailing out of Bristol on the west coast, southwest coast of England. And of course, there are names there in Ireland still. Wexford, of course. The ford is not a ford in our sense, but a fjord. Strangford Loch in the northeast of Ireland is the fjord where the current is very strong. And it's so strong that today they use it to use the power of the water to generate electricity, the power of the tides. Well, I hope I've answered some of your questions. And if you have got any more at any time, please let me know. I'll just scroll back to the top just in case some have come in the last minute or two. Will I be posting a reading list? Yes, I can do that. I'll talk to James about this and see how we can do that. Relationship between the Romans and Vikings? No, they lived very different periods. The Romans really left Northern Europe. They were leaving Britain by the 5th century. And of course, the Vikings weren't appearing until the end of the 8th, the beginning of the 9th century. You're from Great Falls. That sounds a wonderful place to live. Anna from New York, that was the relationship between the Vikings and the Romans. And I think, oh, the name of the Viking woman, Laurie from South Lake Tahoe, the name of the Viking woman whose life I described, U-double-N. She's known as the deep-minded, sometimes described with a different name, Aud, A-U-D. And you'll find her stories in virtually all of the family sagas of the Icelanders. She features in the very first chapter. She's one of the founding mothers of Iceland. Right, I think that's it. I'm going to stop now, but to say thank you again for these wonderful questions. There are always so many. I hope I've answered them. And if not, I will come back to you on them. But there's another little book which you might enjoy, especially if you've got any young members of the family. It's written by a friend of mine who'd probably not be very happy I've mentioned it, but it is his best-selling book. Although he is a very fine academic and has published a lot of academic books, the one that has sold best is called The Norse Warrior's Manual, How to be a Viking. And it gives a lot of very good information in a very digestible form for young people. So that might be worth thinking about for birthdays or Christmases. Once again, thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing you sometime in the not too distant future. Thank you. Bye-bye.